So welcome everybody. Thank you for attending today for this webinar on ethics and professional commitment. It has a subtitle of Understanding Expectations for Building Engineers, but I hope that the content today is useful for students and practitioners from any discipline, because the common ethical considerations that the professions have as a whole are very much reflected in the frameworks that CABE uses and vice versa. So without further ado, I'm going to turn off my camera and we will start on the presentation. What are we going to look at today? We're going to talk about what we mean by professional ethics, and by we, I mean CABE. This is our interpretation of the ethical frameworks that we work with. We're going to look at why professional ethics and a commitment to professional values matter. We're going to talk about some key concepts relevant to professional behaviour. So these are kind of underlying concepts that, again, are relevant to most professional groups. We're going to talk about the meaning and structure of professional commitment for building engineers, which is based on the Engineering Council's frameworks. But again, the considerations and the structure of that framework are useful for anyone working in the built environment sector. We'll look briefly at codes of conduct and ethical issues in practice, and then some key takeaways. So, the meaning of professional ethics and why it is needed. In its most basic sense, one definition of ethics is that it's the moral principles that govern a person's behaviours or the conducting of an activity. So it's an overarching set of principles that we apply to the work that we do on a daily basis. There are very many definitions of ethics. There are very many definitions of morality. And if you want to get into these concepts in great depth, philosophers have written many interesting thoughts and have many views on the meaning of ethics and morality. But in terms of practical application, when we start talking about ethics, quite often people think it is a philosophical debate, that it's theoretical, that it has no relevance to what they do. So one way of understanding why we think professional ethics is so important is to go back into the origin of the word ethos, which is derived from the Greek for way of living. It's a branch of philosophy concerned with human conduct, and more specifically the behaviour of individuals in society. But I think what's useful about this is when someone says professional ethics or ethics, if you think about it as a way of living, a professional way of living, and you'll see later in this webinar, the very practical building blocks, the behaviours, the activities that need to be part of that professional way of living, it's a much more useful model than thinking about it as a philosophical study. Ethics include the discipline of dealing with what is good and bad, and understanding and acting on moral duty and obligation. And morality, again, is another complex concept where there is a huge variety of interpretations, and often based in cultural or personal norms. Morality can vary in many respects, but it's most commonly defined as the principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong, or good and bad behaviour. And throughout this discussion today, throughout this webinar, I'm going to be talking about the need for building professionals to do not only things that are compliant or that meet code, but also to ensure that the outcomes that derive from the decisions and activities they undertake are right. Morality can then vary from person to person, but we have established frameworks here, and we'll look at those which try to create a baseline that everyone shares in terms of identifying what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. But morality is also not constant. Societies can change their mind about what is acceptable. Now, the story I'm going to use to provide a little bit of external context relates to a legal case in 1884 of the Crown versus Dudley and Stevens. Now, this related to some shipwrecked mariners who were picked up by another ship. They were rescued on the high seas, but were found to have exercised what's known as survival cannibalism in relation to one of the other members of their crew. Now, this had been deemed an acceptable practice under the custom of the sea for a very long time indeed. But in this case, the two sailors who were rescued had hastened the death of their comrade before consuming him. And, and society as a whole recoiled at this, and the acceptability of survival cannibalism was quashed. And in law, it was established that necessity is not a defense to a charge of murder. Both of the shipmen were executed for their crimes, but they were crimes which they freely admitted to when they were picked up because they thought it was acceptable. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, firstly, it's a memorable story, but it's one of those moments where something that has been deemed acceptable becomes not acceptable. And I think it's very important for us to remember that just because other people do things, or just because things have always been done in a particular way, or people argue that they've been done in a particular way, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's right. We all have a professional obligation to exercise our own judgments, or be at risk of censure by society as a whole. Now, alongside that, we also have to bear in mind on a constant basis the responsibilities that we have to wider society. So this is, I think, a quite useful quote. Human well-being is not a random phenomenon. It depends on many factors ranging from genetics and neurobiology to sociology and economics. So this is very much about the fact that societies and the decisions that we make within those societies are complex. But it's the second part that I think is most useful. Wherever we can have an impact on the well-being of others, questions of morality apply. I think that's useful because it's a reminder that whenever we make decisions or undertake actions that can affect others, and in the built environment, everything we do has the capability to affect others. All that we do in that space has impact on others. And that means that we have to be mindful of our ethical and moral obligations at all times whilst we are working. Now, why do ethics matter? I think we all understand more now than we did perhaps in the past the importance of ethics. But ethics are an absolutely critical distinction or discerning factor between those people who are genuinely professional and those people who are perhaps not so professional. Professionals set themselves apart by considering the wider impacts of their actions whilst meeting their legal, moral, and contractual duties. And in doing so, they ensure trust and confidence amongst clients and others, which is particularly important in the construction industry, which is at times high risk and where safety considerations are paramount. Now, the construction industry has had and continues to have many problems. This is an extract from the Farmer Review of 2016, which looked at the UK construction labour model, but contains a pretty useful analysis of the nature of the UK construction industry as a whole. And it has identified some well-known, well-understood. This was not a revolutionary report. These are factors that were quite well understood, but it reflects a whole series of problems that the sector has had over time. It has low productivity, low predictability, so time and cost are uncertain, which creates huge pressure. It's structurally fragmented. 93% of construction businesses have 7 or fewer people. It's hard to communicate with. It's hard to lead, so there's leadership fragmentation. The business models that have predominated due to over-competition are based on low margins, adversarial pricing models, and financial fragility. It has a dysfunctional training, funding, and delivery model. There are significant challenges in the workforce size and demographics. Those are only getting worse. It's great news in terms of employment prospects because there just aren't enough people to go around, but actually it creates a mismatch between supply and demand to actually get the work done, which creates its own pressures. The industry has a lack of collaboration and improvement culture. It has a lack of research and development and investment in innovation. And all of this combines to create a very poor industry image, which further makes recruitment and retention difficult. Now, all of these factors plus others came together and are exemplified by the catastrophic and tragic events at Grenfell Tower. Now, there are multiple root causes of the fire, which were identified in the public inquiry and in all of the evidence that's come forward. But they included a whole series of ethical failures, which go right to the root of the criticism of construction and built environment industries culture. That included a lack of professional accountability, individuals and organizations working beyond the limits of their competence, dishonesty and misrepresentation, lack of accuracy and rigor, disregard for the welfare of others, and prioritization of profit over safety. As we go through the remainder of this presentation, I hope it's clear that committing to having and maintaining professional standards is absolutely fundamental to avoiding these failings being repeated. Dame Judith Hackett commented extensively on the culture and nature of the industry. I've pulled out 3 quotes here. She said, "We need to put a focus on the way in which buildings are procured. If we have a process that makes people bid at a cost they can't afford to deliver at, we set ourselves up to fail." So that's about knowingly setting targets or providing resource and time allocations that are inadequate. Those practices effectively help to create a cultural issue across the sector, which can be described as a race to the bottom, caused either through ignorance, indifference, or because the system does not facilitate good practice. And finally, the mindset of doing things as cheaply as possible and passing on responsibility for problems and shortcomings to others must stop. So within that, we have professional incompetence, we have unwillingness to be accountable, to take responsibility for actions. We have people knowingly looking to offset their responsibilities onto others. These are all fundamentally poor professional behaviours and mindsets and need to be addressed. Within the whole process, it's also important to understand that regardless of the rules and regulations that apply, people and their behaviours, professionals and their behaviours, are central to determining outcomes. This is still an industry where what individuals do within their organisations or teams really has huge impacts. And equally, if we have good behaviours, we can get better outcomes, but bad behaviours have predominated. So commercial pressures in the industry have driven the business models to the lowest common denominator level. So safety measures and other protections have been stripped out so that people compete for work. The systemic failures that drives accumulate over time because margins and boundaries of safety are continually tested and salami sliced. They've effectively chipped away at over time until things break. Bad behaviors then become institutionalized and accepted as standard custom and practice. And by that, what I mean is that people say, well, that's right because we've always done it that way, even though that practice may actually be defective and unacceptable. It's seen as the norm. And ultimately, many of the systems we rely on are only as good as the people operating them. Professionals have a critical role in ensuring that ethical behaviours are reinserted into this process now. It's one of the quickest ways for us to change the outcomes we have, and in terms, particularly in terms of balancing ethical and commercial considerations and keeping people safe. And I've put this quote in by Albert Schweitzer, who is a German French philosopher and a Nobel Peace Prize winner. "A man is ethical only when life as such is sacred to him." And I think we all need to constantly remind ourselves of that imperative. So let's look at some key concepts that are useful in actually applying ethical standards in practice. The first thing I wanted to talk about was our understanding of the word or meaning of the word professional. Um, this meaning has changed significantly over time. Virtually everyone now will call themselves professional. It's a term that's appended to an extraordinarily wide range of occupations, trades, undertakings. And that's based on what is shown here as definition 2 from Wikipedia, a kind of very contemporary understanding of the meaning of word professional. So a professional is a member of a profession or any person who works in a specified professional activity. Now, I don't agree with this definition, and I don't think a great many others will either. I prefer to think along the lines that Elliot Friedson thinks. Now, Elliot Friedson was a philosopher who spent his entire career looking at professionalism, professional institutions and bodies and concepts. And he said that professionals demonstrate an ideology that asserts greater commitment to doing good work than to economic gain and to the quality rather than the economic efficiency of work. So what Friedson is saying really is that good professionals are not prioritizing gain or the generation of wealth over the quality of the work they do and the benefits that it delivers in society. Now, that may be a little bit to one extreme again, but in practice, professionals should not be allowing their commercial interests to overwhelm their responsibilities to others and to the environment in the work that they do. Another way of understanding this, and in terms of what makes professionals different from non-professionals, is to consider expectation in relation to the public interest. So the concept of the public interest recognizes that there's an inherent tension between commercial interests and the interests of wider society. Or, in other words, acting in the public interest requires professionals to balance the wider interests of society with the ability to make a living. We have to be mindful of the impacts overall. We also have to be very careful that our own interests, our financial gain, don't distort the judgments that we make and the advice that we give. Now, this is a very difficult thing for individuals to exercise, if you like, on a day-to-day basis. If you're working for a firm and they have contracts and appointments with clients or other organizations, you have other legal commitments that you have to meet. They can often be complex and overlapping, sometimes contradictory. It can be very difficult to firstly identify what the right decision is in the public interest, and secondly, to then have the agency, to have the authority to actually make those decisions. But that's been recognized for a long time, this difficulty of individuals being able to actually assess what the public interest is on a moment by moment basis. And professional bodies have evolved standards and approaches to the way that their members work and are assessed, which help to actually set some parameters for how working in the public interest looks on a day-to-day basis. That includes setting standards for competence that should be met, so only doing work if you're actually competent to do it. Codes of conduct that set out behaviours which are intended to balance commercial and public interests. So there's a whole range of behaviours and activities that we'll talk about later, which are there to ensure that the public interest is served by professionals who are appointed to do work, but also ethical expectations that help professionals differentiate between what is right and what is wrong. Again, we might all think inherently that we know what is right and what is wrong, but this is a very complex industry and it throws up all sorts of dilemmas where being able to make that distinction can sometimes feel very difficult indeed. Again, I will probably repeat this a number of times, but The professional framework that CABE has, the professional frameworks that other professional bodies have put in place over time, which tend to cover a wide range of uh, scope from technical competencies through to ethical standards. Those frameworks are there to actively support members in managing this balance of interests so that the public interest is properly served. There's a recognised public interest defence associated with this, which is also important to understand. Construction is highly complex. It will regularly throw ethical dilemmas in the way of professionals. It will create the circumstances whereby professionals have to exercise ethical judgment are frequent. These are not rare issues. But where public safety is concerned, or the health and safety of others, you have an obligation to act by raising your concerns, even if this risks putting you in breach of contractual or other legal duties. And there is a recognised public interest defence whereby certain duties for confidentiality, perhaps, or to expose information that would otherwise be concealed to avoid sanction or penalties, is a recognised public interest defence. If you have to kind of breach one set of requirements in order to protect the safety of others. Professionals have a duty of care. You will often hear people refer to duty of care. It's a legal obligation which requires individuals and organisations to adhere to a standard of reasonable care while performing any acts that could foreseeably harm others. In the construction industry, that extends to all professionals, I would say, but also to all of those who are on site, really. But professionals in particular are expected to ensure their actions do not compromise the safety and well-being of others involved in the projects. We have to understand, and again, it's easy to forget when you're doing the day-to-day job, that clients and third parties include residents, and they include all the people who use a building, whether that's a school or a hospital or a home or an office. You have a responsibility to them to execute projects safely and competently, and breaches of that duty can lead to legal disputes, financial losses, reputational damage. And all of this highlights the critical importance of understanding and upholding these duty of care obligations. The obligations come in various different forms. There are statutory duties. So society has recognised the risks that are associated with construction and the built environment, and it's imposed duties through legislation such as the Defective Premises Act and the building regulations, which are there primarily to protect the health, safety, welfare and of people in and around buildings. Common law duties, which arise out of case law and judicial decisions, which require professionals to act reasonably and prudently to avoid causing harm to others. Contractual duties, which often involve specific performance standards, timelines, and quality requirements, but also tortious duties, which require professionals to take reasonable care to avoid causing harm to anyone who might be affected by their actions. Breaches of tortious duty fall under the realm of negligence and are different because they apply broadly, whereas common law duties tend to apply in relation to the case law and statutes that are developed. And we have professional duties and standards, a kind of broad concept of what professional behaviours are meant to be. Now, in England and Wales, many of these professional characteristics have effectively been written into law through the Building Safety Act and building regulations and duty holding system that's now been brought into place. Just to stress, the duty holding system applies to all building work. There are additional requirements for high-risk buildings, but it does apply to all building work. And it requires that all professionals and others within the industry have the necessary skills, knowledge, experience, and exhibit the right behaviours to deliver compliant and safe outcomes. Now, professionals have these expectations because they typically have a significant advantage in knowledge and understanding over those they are appointed to advise. And that gives professionals a lot of power. People have to put faith in the judgments and facts that are presented by professionals. And so that professional responsibility has to be exercised very responsibly. Now, the general expectations found in most codes of conduct and professional standards um, are very consistent. They vary in the way they're expressed, but realistically, professionals are expected to demonstrate honesty and integrity, accuracy and rigor. So that's exercising reasonable skill and care. They are expected to be accountable. They take responsibility for their decisions and actions and for the work of those who are under their supervision or direction. They ensure that the work they do is legally compliant. They apply ethical standards and make sure that the decisions and advice they give are ethically sound, and they behave in a way which is respectful, regardless of circumstance. Something that can often be difficult, but maintaining professional behavior is absolutely critical to achieving the right outcomes. Sometimes maintaining those high standards of professional conduct can be very, very challenging. Other people in the industry who do not exhibit professional behaviors may be aggressive, they may lie, they may make accusations. Um, they may try to influence what you do by telling you that it's okay to do something that you may feel is not right. What is critical is that you do not allow your own conduct to be affected by the behavior of others who are less professional than you are. That can be difficult, but it's the right thing to do, and it will always leave a good professional in a better position in the longer term. Perhaps the most important concept that every professional has to understand and has to apply in their work relates to limits of competence. This links into a wider range of themes around managing your own competence, which we'll come on to in a moment in terms of professional development. But if you do not understand when you've reached the limits of your competence, you are putting not only yourself at risk, but you are putting others at risk. So understanding when to say no, we believe is the most important professional characteristic for building engineers, and probably that applies equally to all other building professionals as well. It's a judgment call, but you should never be afraid to say, no, I need to get some more expert advice. That could relate to a wide range of issues. It could relate to technical issues. So you have an obligation to ensure you have the skills, knowledge, and experience necessary to undertake work that consistently meets the required standards. As I said, you should absolutely be mindful of the limits of your competence. If you've never done something before, or you've never worked on a type of building work or building work before, or you're being asked to undertake a task, you need to sense check whether you really are competent to do that and what the risks are. You need to commit to ongoing learning and development to maintain or develop the competence that's necessary to do the work that you do. And you need to have a profound understanding of the ethical considerations relevant to your work to help you make better decisions that help balance competing interests. All of this relates to ensuring that you have the knowledge necessary as to where boundaries are and where expectations sit. Finally, in this section, just conflict of interest. Conflict of interest is a very complex issue in that it requires quite high levels of professional judgment in a lot of circumstances to identify some of the more subtle conflicts. But effectively, a conflict of interest arises when there's a real or perceived risk that a professional's actions or decisions for a client or in the public interest will be materially and adversely affected by another client's interest or by a personal interest. So there can be conflicts of interest can be very subtle. It can be about previous relationships. They can be very unsubtle, where someone's effectively trying to bribe you. And on the right, we've got the list of the key areas. So conflict of interest can arrive under financial interests, which might be that they have a financial interest in a company or a service. They may have personal relationships that give rise to a conflict. So if they are related to someone else or have a close friendship or previous engagement with a project stakeholder that influences their judgment, that could be seen as a personal conflict of interest. There are potential conflicts of interest where engineers are representing more than one organization. Those organizations might have very competing priorities. They may have very conflicting agendas, and you may find yourself trying to serve both. And that's not uncommon. There may be conflicts of interest in meeting contractual obligations. This is particularly true where there is a tension between the ethical obligations to the wider public and the public interest are contradictory to the instructions contained within a contract. And then there are conflicts that arise out of previous employment or commercial relationships. There may well be confidential information or particular knowledge that creates a conflict where someone acts for another party after having been employed by a third party. There are numerous examples where this arises, but in its simplest form, there's an expectation that if anyone identifies a conflict of interest in their professional work, they should step away from it. That's the first thing, is just simply step away and say, I'm sorry, I can't take this contract. I'm sorry, I can't take on this role because I'm conflicted. But if that's not possible, and it's always there's always the potential that circumstances don't permit that, then you have to be transparent about the conflict of interest that exists. So you need to tell the clients and those who are affected that exists, and manage that to the best extent possible, whilst avoiding decisions being affected. So those are useful concepts. Those are kind of key underlying concepts for professionals. The professional frameworks that CABE has and other professional bodies have are intended to support people in applying or living up to those expectations. And we refer to this as professional commitment. So the key documents for CABE membership in this respect are the CABE competence framework, which sets out the level and range of expectations for all of our membership in terms of their competence. I'll talk a bit more about that structure in a moment. And then the Code of Professional Conduct and Guide to Ethical Professionalism. These are meant to be not just used at the moment where there's a complaint or a problem, or where you're applying for assessment. They're intended to be used as a reference source as well, to help you understand the expectations that there are for building engineers. Now, every professional body will have a similar suite of documents, and so the principles that I'm talking about here are going to be relevant to any discipline. But in our case, our competence framework sets out competence expectations across 5 distinct categories, which are based on structures developed by the Engineering Council. Section A is about knowledge and understanding, so that's technical principles and technologies. Section B is about design, development, and solving problems, so that's about applying appropriate methods when undertaking building engineering tasks. Section C is about responsibility management and leadership, so competence has many dimensions. This is about managing work and taking accountability, being accountable for that work, and providing leadership as necessary. Section D covers communications and interpersonal skills. We all work within teams. Very few people work in absolute isolation in construction. We need to be able to communicate. We need to be able to work effectively with others. And Section E covers professional commitments and standards, which is the area that I'm going to focus on next. Now, each of those A, B, C, D, E sections is split down into a number of competence areas, and Section E is no different, and it has 5 building blocks. E1 talks about compliance with codes of conduct. E2 talks about managing and applying safe systems of work. E3 requires an understanding of the principles of sustainability and to act sustainably. E4 looks at carrying out and recording suitable professional development, and E5 looks at acting ethically. More people who apply to join CABE, and I would also note some of the other assessment systems that we run. More people fail because they can't answer questions on professional commitment adequately. They may be technically very good, they may know how to do their job very well, but they can't explain their understanding of these five absolutely fundamental professional building blocks. So whilst technical and managerial skills are critical, a genuine commitment to understanding these professional standards and behaviours is absolutely key to being a competent professional. It's fair to say that when we talk about professional ethics as being a professional way of living, it's these five building blocks that are probably the fundamentals that need to be applied. Let's look at them in more detail. So CABE has a code of conduct which sets expectations for our members in terms of what we expect them, how we expect them to work, in terms of professional values and behaviours. And secondly, it also provides a standard against which professional conduct can be measured if there is a complaint which is referred into a disciplinary process. We have two documents that are really relevant: the CABE Code of Professional Conduct, which imposes mandatory requirements which must be met as a condition of membership, and standards, which are a principle-based set of professional behaviours, which are used to measure whether a breach of the code of conduct has happened. Codes of conduct are fundamental for professional bodies because they allow us to protect the public where any of our members are not behaving in line with our expectations. And we also have a document called the Guide to Ethical Professionalism, which sets out a wider range of considerations. Competence E2, safe systems of work. This relates to all of the legal requirements that come under health and safety. If you work in the UK, those requirements relate primarily to the CDM regulations, 2015, Construction Design and Management Regulations. But it also applies more broadly to concepts of managing risk. The Engineering Council provides guidance on this, covering professional and responsible judgment and leadership in managing risk, systematic, holistic approach to risk identification, assessment, management and review, compliance with legislation and codes, and being prepared to go further, ensuring good contextual communication with the others involved, ensuring sustainable systems for oversight, and contributing to public awareness of risk. All of these Engineering Council documents are freely available online for further reference. That includes the principles of sustainability, which again, this is the entire document on the screen. They're not long documents, they're very concise. They really are very good in terms of setting out the principles. And in terms of sustainability, that's about contributing to building a sustainable society, present and future, applying professional and responsible judgment and leadership, doing more than just complying with legislation and being prepared to challenge the status quo, using resources efficiently and effectively, seeking multiple views to solve sustainability challenges, and managing risk to minimize adverse impacts and maximize benefits. We talked earlier about wherever our work impacts on others, creating a moral imperative. Construction is responsible for 60% of all the waste created in the UK each year, and buildings are responsible for 40% of carbon emissions. CPD is absolutely critical, so professional development, and that needs to be planned, undertaken in line with gap analysis, and then recorded on an annual basis. And we also encourage our members to look at adopting competency-based approaches through our competence management system. And we'll talk about more of that in subsequent webinars and sessions on another date. Finally, acting ethically, and I'm going to go through and summarize the 4 sections of this. Again, this is the whole document. It is a distilled understanding of ethical considerations from a very broad-based but very old set of engineering professional understandings. So what are the 4 kind of main areas? Well, honesty and integrity, so being reliable and trustworthy, alert to the ways in which work and behaviour might affect others, respect privacy, rights and reputations, respect confidentiality, declare conflicts of interest, avoid deception and take steps to prevent or report corrupt practices or professional misconduct, and reject bribery and improper influence. Respect for law, the life and public good means that all engineering professionals should have a duty to obey applicable laws and regulations, give due weight to facts, publish standards and guidance. They should hold paramount the health and safety of others and draw attention to hazards, ensure their work is lawful and justified, and recognise the importance of physical and cyber security and data protection. Respect and protect personal information and IPR, protect and where possible improve quality of natural environments, maximise the public good, take due account of limited availability of natural resources, and uphold the reputation of the profession. They need to demonstrate accuracy and rigour, act with care, performing services only in areas in which they are competent, keep their knowledge and skills up to date, assist the development of engineering knowledge and skills in others, present and review theory, evidence, and interpretation honestly, accurately, objectively, and without bias, whilst respecting reasoned alternative views, identify, evaluate, quantify, mitigate, and manage risks, and not knowingly mislead or allow others to be misled. And finally, it sets expectations for leadership and communication. Engineering professionals have a duty to promote high standards for leadership and communication and should be aware of the issues that engineering and technology raise for society or any other professional system. If you're not an engineer, just think about the discipline that you work in. This is absolutely relevant. We need to be aware of the key issues that affect our sectors. Promote equality, diversity, and inclusion. Promote public awareness and understanding of the impact of professional activities we undertake. Be objective and truthful in any statement made in our professional capacities and challenge statements or policies that cause professional concern. If you think something is risky, if you think something is wrong, you should challenge that. You should do it in the way that's suggested here. It should be a rational, evidence-based, accurate, objective, and reasoned way of objecting, but you should raise concerns nonetheless. So these principles, I think you will already be able to see resonate with a great deal of the other concepts and ideas that we've talked about in this session so far. I just wanted to flag two other pieces of guidance from the Engineering Council that are useful. So the Engineering Council publishes guidance on whistleblowing, which cover what whistleblowing is, obligations if you have concerns, what the relevant legislation says, how to raise a concern, and where to get further advice. Our industry needs more people to be willing to whistleblow. It will help make the industry better, but it's not always easy to do. And this is a very helpful piece of advice if you do have concerns that you want to raise. And then there's further guidance on security, primarily cybersecurity, covering 6 key principles, which I will talk about a little bit more later. Now, that framework, that professional commitment framework works, we believe. We believe it works because we work with people who've come through the engineering frameworks, but it's also reflected in some real world evidence. So this is something called the Ipsos Mori Veracity Index, so that every year they ask quite a large number of people in the general public a question. They say, now I'll read you a list of different types of people. For each, would you tell me if you generally trust them to tell the truth or not? And engineers currently, in the most recent poll, rank second, where 90% of people said they believed that engineers would be likely to tell the truth. Engineers are consistently ranked in the top 5 in this poll, and I think it's a very direct representation of the way that framework of professional commitment creates balanced professional capabilities, but also prioritizes the right behaviors that develop trust. So let's have a look at some ethical issues in practice. I'll go through these relatively quickly. I think that what I want to achieve with this session is to just make it clear that ethics in practice are the things that you come across every day. They are not unusual issues in the large part. They are actually very day-to-day considerations. And the Royal Academy undertook further work looking at ethics in the engineering profession in June 2023, and this section is largely drawn from that work. And as part of that, they ranked the key areas of ethical concern from, I think it was 39 engineering businesses, and that's the table of the ranking there on the left-hand side. Now, what were the top 9 issues within that ranking? Number 1 was safety, physical, mental health, and well-being of workers. Number 2 was business integrity. Number 3 was cybersecurity. Number 4 was equal opportunities, discrimination, diversity, and inclusion. Number 5 was data privacy. Number 6 was environmental and climate protection. Number 7 was bullying and harassment. Number 8 was potential negative impacts of products or services on others in terms of safety, well-being, and privacy. And number 9 was payment of applicable taxes. So these are not strange, highly complex philosophical issues. These are the fundamental issues where ethical judgment has to be applied. I'm going to go through these in a little bit of detail, just so that we can see the kind of very day-to-day way that ethics is integrated into our thinking. So looking at safety, mental health, and well-being, this is seen as a big priority in the survey, but it involves very practical things that we would all hope our employers are committed to. Embedding a proactive safety culture, ensuring safe practices in the workplace and on sites, provision of training on safety and mental health, provision of suitable personal protective equipment, managing risk for hazardous tasks and undertaking risk assessments, providing access to mental health support and training in mental health first aiders. How do you meet your ethical obligations in these respects? Well, we all work and know of places where this is part of the normal governance structure and day-to-day management. Business integrity was the second highest issue, and firms showed high levels of preparedness for this. Business integrity related to a range of issues where criminal or corrupt activities could undermine the reputation or the viability or the ability of organizations to compete for work. So procurement was an extremely high priority, and having processes in place to ensure that procurement is undertaken in a way with financial probity that avoids corruption, complies with relevant procurement law, and also includes assessment of the supply chain in terms of how well that supply chain, subcontractors, subconsultants, how well they align with the parent organization's values. Now, we may think that the days of brown envelopes and corruption are past, but that's really not the case, unfortunately. And corruption and bribery can manifest in a lot of different ways. And again, that's a subject on itself for another day. But these firms also have anti-bribery policies and processes, and provide training and to staff into how to identify corruption and what to do about it. There are issues around legal compliance, and there are also issues around conflict of interest. So again, these are all things that are familiar and have come up earlier in the session. Cybersecurity with the third, and data privacy with the third and fifth biggest concerns, and that's about having awareness of risks, including use of social media and how this can be used to breach security, compliance with relevant legal compliance for data protection, being aware of the considerations that are necessary in terms of how information is stored, communicated, transported, and disposed of, and having effective systems for security governance. And again, I'll just refer back to the guidance on security that I mentioned earlier that the Engineering Council publishes. The fourth issue is diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is quite rightfully very high up on the list. And the survey said that engineers and technicians reinforce DEIs high on the list of priorities in the engineering workplace, with 86% of engineers and technicians agreeing that diversity and inclusion is important in their organization. So ethical actions, ethical activities that would be very normal include measuring and monitoring diversity, making the workplace welcoming to people from more diverse backgrounds, tackling discrimination against women was highlighted in this particular survey as a particular area where attention was needed, balancing diversity with exposure to disproportionate risk, engaging with technical communities less comfortable with issues relating to human behavior, where methodologies are lacking in right or wrong, is more blurred. So one of the ethical challenges with engineers in particular is that they are very used to dealing with issues that you can calculate the solution to, and they are less comfortable dealing with emotional and behavioral issues, and supporting a neurodiverse workforce. Sustainability is the sixth item and last item that I'm going to talk about, which is led by goals on greenhouse emissions. It's a science-based problem that building professionals should understand and have skills to mitigate. But it's not just about the environment. There are other sustainability issues, such as work of welfare, negative community impacts, and modern slavery that also need to be included in this. So again, aspects of ethical behaviors that you will see in your day-to-day work and in the businesses and organizations you work with include their company policies and impact analysis on the work they undertake and how that impacts sustainability, linking their processes and policies to UN sustainability goals, auditing and monitoring their operational carbon emissions, dealing and addressing issues of embodied carbon and life cycle costings, particularly relevant to any professionals working in a design discipline, supply chain management to align with climate change policies, but also to take into account risks of human trafficking, bonded labor and child labor, or use of harmful or toxic materials, and behaving in a manner which respects other people's views and beliefs in terms of the environment as well. So being able to have conversations that are respectful on this matter. As I said before, construction has a huge part to play. It has huge impacts on our environment. And so these are very important issues. I'm not going to go through the other issues. I'm just going to look at some kind of key takeaways to wrap this up. I'm running over time slightly. Our view is that adopting a professional way of living is fundamental to being a good professional and ensuring your work achieves the right balance. Prioritizing ethical behavior is not only the right thing to do, it will also help in terms of legal compliance and in maintaining your own mental health and well-being. Understand and exercise your rights and obligations, seek support to do the right thing if necessary. And there are three kind of key areas. Understand and meet your duties about the public interest, duties of care, prioritizing health and safety of everyone impacted by your work, acting sustainability and managing conflicts of interest. Manage your competence. I cannot stress how important working within limits of competence is, and how important continuing to invest in high quality lifelong learning. And use the code of conduct to help you in your day-to-day work. Familiarize yourself with mandatory requirements. Whichever code applies to you, there are many codes of conduct. Be familiar with those that are relevant to you, and use it to help defend your own professional integrity. If you are being pushed to do something that you know is contrary to what's required in the code, show people the code and say, no, I can't do that. It's against my code of conduct. It really does help, but use it. It should be an active and living document. Finally, I'm going to end with a couple of quotes that I think are useful, or I hope are useful. The first is from Mark Twain. He says, "It is curious that physical courage should be so common in the world and moral courage so rare." And the second, from W. Clement Stone, who is a businessman, philanthropist, and I'm not sure he would be very happy at being described as a self-help book author, but that's what they said. But have the courage to say no. Have the courage to face the truth. Do the right thing because it is right. These are the magic keys to living your life with integrity. I think it is absolutely fundamental that as professionals, we live in that way. It will leave us with fewer problems in the long term, and we will have the satisfaction of knowing that the right things have been done. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I'm going to have a look in the Q&A and try and see if I can answer some of these. I'll just work through. Conflict of interest can be negative as well as positive, right? Says Leanne Barclay. Conflict of interest is never really a good thing. I can't think of an instance. I'd be very interested if you wanted to email in with an example of where conflict of interest is a positive matter. If you're conflicted, it means that your judgment is being affected by factors, other factors, beyond the immediate contract you have with your clients or wider society. So I'm not sure I would agree that conflict of interest can be positive. We have a statement from an anonymous attendee. Can a conflict of interest be misogyny when you are a woman and the designer has stated this to you? I think um, that's probably something that needs to be dealt with through other aspects of any code of conduct. Um, I think that's very much about someone potentially having a poor understanding of um, respect for diversity and inclusion, and respecting fellow professionals. I think that's a difficult question to answer. Um, those are the only questions that I have in the Q&A. I'm just going to check in the chat. There aren't any there. If anyone has any further questions, I'd be very happy for you to email in. Given that there's nothing more in terms of questions for me to answer, I'll just finish by saying that I hope that that presentation has been useful. There's a great deal of depth behind many of the principles and a great deal more depth in terms of examining the specifics of the different expectations of behaviour set out in the ethical principles, but also in the CABE Code of Conduct and in other codes of conduct. There's a huge amount that sits behind considerations of bribery and corruption, and supply chain management, responsible supply chain management. So this is really a brief introduction, but I hope it's been helpful in terms of explaining some key concepts, and in starting to exemplify that so much that we do actually has an ethical dimension, which is why ensuring that ethics are a priority in our professional lives is such a critical thing to achieve and ensure. Thank you very much, and I'm going to end the session there.